Hello and welcome to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast. I am Jason Mann, and with me today he is a common guest, and he's here for a very good reason. He has a new book, Tall Tales and Short Shorts, Dr. J, Pistol Pete, and the Birth of the Modern NBA, which comes out on May 16th. Adam Criblez, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Jason, for having me.
So, why the 70s?
Man, why not the 70s? The 70s are awesome. Well, why the 70s actually goes back to baseball. So a couple years ago, I was really into trying to get into some sport history again and happened across a fantastic book about baseball in the 1970s, written by a man named Dan Epstein, and it's entitled Big Hair and Plastic Grass. And it gives it's an incredibly well-researched book, but it's also very approachable, accessible. It gives an overview of kind of baseball in the 1970s, but ties it into movements in pop culture and that sort of thing. So being a huge basketball fan, I started looking for something similar that had been written about basketball and found that it really didn't exist, that I didn't find anything that really kind of filled that gap that Epstein's book did about baseball. And so that was why the 1970s. I didn't know that much about the NBA in the 1970s before I started this project. I knew some of the players and some of the teams, but had nowhere near the level of knowledge that it took to write this book. But the 1970s, why the 1970s? Mostly because it was kind of a gap, and as I grew to research more, I just really fell in love with that period in sports history.
Yeah, and I think we kind of felt the same way, doing the podcast. Obviously, you were a big help, appearing on several of the episodes and helping out with, when I was looking up some things that came to you with some ideas and talking about stuff. So I think we felt a lot of the same sort of feelings once we really dug into the 70s with our project last summer and getting that. And obviously, once I found out you were writing the book, very excited to do that. And even with the research that we've been able to do, there was still plenty in the book that I, didn't know or hadn't gotten the full story for. So, is there anything that really stands out? You said that you weren't super familiar with the 70s before you did your research, so there may be several things, but was there anything that really stood out as like a huge surprise, when you were doing your research?
So really what I knew about the 1970s was that it was a time before, it was a time between two golden ages. And so the narrative that I had always read and hearing about basketball history, and this was only reinforced by reading books like, Bill Simmons' Book of Basketball, is that the 1960s were this almost like a silver age where there were only a few teams, only the best players were able to play. You had these legends, almost Paul Bunyan-esque, Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell and Oscar Robertson and Jerry West, and that then there was kind of this in-between period, almost like the Dark Ages in Europe, and then all of a sudden from this sprang the renaissance of Magic Johnson and Larry Bird and Michael Jordan, and that it was almost this period that people didn't talk about. So that was kind of my perception going in, was that it was kind of an era where not a lot happened, and it was kind of something you could skip over. So really everything was a surprise, just learning about how much went on in that decade. And I think, as part of the subtitle of the book alludes to, the fact that I really see in that decade the birth of the modern NBA is really kind of in the mid to late 1970s.
Yeah, I think the kind of the narrative that you're talking about that Simmons has popularized and others have talked about. I really think a lot of that is born from Breaks of the Game, the David Halberstam book.
Sure.
I really think a lot of that, the influence of the thinking of the 70s, kind of stems from that, and some of it is very true. I mean, I'm not disputing really the reporting in that book, but I do think the way that it's been framed. It's not completely accurate. It's not a full picture. I mean, there is so much, interesting stuff, and you've touched upon it. Really, I think it's kind of one of the central ideas in your book is that the 70s are really kind of the NBA's adolescence. Where there's new teams, players are having new freedoms. There's just all this type of expansion in the league. There's all this growth. There's all, growing pains that, kind of come from that with, rushing into new markets and sometimes haphazardly and but really paving the way for the success that would come later in the 80s. A lot of the 70s growth had to lead to that, and it wasn't exactly a straightforward path. There were obviously dips here. There were ratings drops in the late 70s, and there were many other issues that went on. A few teams had serious financial issues, which you talk about in the book. But I do think it's more of I think it can be better thought of as a not just like a bridge we passed over, but as really some fundamental things that happened in the 70s really paved way for some interesting things in the 80s. And we're going to talk about kind of where some of those ideas first happened in the 70s and bear fruit in the 80s.
Yeah, and I think that I didn't really, when I was writing the book, conceptualize this as an adolescence or a teenage years of the NBA. And it wasn't really until it was written and actually off at the publisher that I was answering some questions about kind of what I'd written about and why. And I kind of formulated that idea that it's really the teenage years. It's an awkward period in which the NBA grows, but it's not really ready to expand as much as it does. And so it adopts the 3-point shot late in the decade, but teams really don't know how to use that shot really for another decade after. And all of these things that are developed and really born in the 1970s, and they're just so early in their stages of development that we talk about the 1980s being this time when the game globalizes and becomes far more appealing to people across the United States and indeed across the world. But that the roots of that are in the 1970s, and that without the decade, without things that the free agency in the game is a fantastic example, that without those sorts of things, the NBA today would be nowhere near as popular as it is. And so doing, just as you mentioned, kind of bridging over the 1970s is, I think, a disservice to that awkward teenage period, as I've kind of termed it, of the NBA in that decade.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a favorite season of the 70s, whether it just, exciting games or most interesting to write about, or, any reason in particular?
That's actually an easy question for me. So my most favorite season in the 1970s, and probably in basketball history, is 1976, 1977. So the 4 teams from the ABA come over to the NBA. You have not only that, but also an influx of a couple players that join teams. Maybe most notably, Maurice Lucas joins the Portland Trail Blazers and helps them to the NBA title in 77. Moses Malone goes to the Trail Blazers and then through the Buffalo Braves to the Houston Rockets. But really, it's so exciting because it's these dream matchups, right? So people wanted to know how Dr. J and the Nets would do. They wanted to know how David Thompson and the Nuggets would do. And although they didn't get their chance with Dr. J on the Nets in the NBA, you do get to see Dr. J matching up against John Havlicek. You do get to see, David Thompson squaring off against, George Gervin's playing for the Spurs. You've got Pistol Pete Maravich playing for the Jazz at that point. You get all these kind of dream matchups, and it's really this. And if you watch games from that year, especially, they may be even more awkward than a lot of the other years, just because you have all of these new teams being thrown into the mix, all these new players. But to me, it's that excitement, that influx of talent that made the 76-77 season just so fascinating for me to research and to watch and to write about.
Yeah, and we're going to get into it a little bit. There's also a really interesting crop of rookies that come into the league that year. Obviously, that's the year that Walton and the Blazers break through and win the championship, and Blazer Mania begins. And and some of the old Lions of the 70s are kind of coming to an end about that time. Frazier and Monroe with the Knicks. Frazier's about to be traded to the Cavs. Some of the other key guys had already retired. Obviously, West and Chamberlain and that sort of thing. A lot of the teams are in really interesting places at that point as well. I mean, there's a lot going on. Yeah, I think that's a really good choice, obviously. And what's interesting to me about that is, that's right around the time in which the league seems to really start to have a bit of a downturn. Certainly TV ratings start to go down, around, I believe it's around 77. And even though, they've had this talent influx and I think it was exciting for the league. For whatever reason, it was around that time that the league started to, turn off some people. And I don't know. I don't know if there's like anything in particular that you think really keyed that, whether it was the Rudy Tomjanovich Kermit Washington fight or the punch, which we talked about on separate episodes, or maybe all this expansion and all this growth has made the league harder to follow, whether it's a racism backlash from the league becoming blacker, whether the perceptions about drug use are popularized and feeling like that's had an effect, or or just feeling like the style of play is not exciting. I don't know if in your research, if there's anything that you found that really is like a key moment that led to that, or if you have any theories as to kind of when that was really started to be a flashpoint.
Yeah, so I think it's actually all of those. And I think one thing that's often overlooked is the role of television in all of this. And so ratings started to drop. And you could argue that the ratings dropped for a number of reasons. I think included in the issues of violence that you raised with the Kermit Washington punch, the drug use escalating, player salaries growing to the point that no longer are those players seen as relatable, is a big issue. And in addition, something that's often overlooked is the fact that the teams that had dominated early in the decade, the big market teams, New York and LA, Chicago even to an extent, these were the best franchises in the NBA in the early 70s. By the mid to late 70s, those are three of the worst. The Lakers actually aren't too bad. They get Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, but they're never able to become an elite level team. And then you have the Bulls and Knicks fall in really hard times. And so you have not only a league that's becoming, as you mentioned, it's becoming blacker. The salaries are escalating. Violence is increasing. The most populous teams, the Knicks and Lakers and Bulls and those sorts of teams, are starting to drop. When those teams start to decline, we start to see ratings decline on TV. And because ratings decline on TV, they get fewer games. And with fewer games, there's less interest generated in the league, and it becomes rather cyclical at that point.
Yeah, it's like you're right. I mean, it definitely is like a confluence of factors. But you look even at like the mid '70s. I mean, like there were some very strong audiences for the NBA Finals. I think the '74 Bucks Celtics in particular had millions watching. I mean, there really was a. It seemed to turn around fairly quickly, and it's just sort of striking because you would think that, I mean, obviously Erving was such a great star, even without the exposure being in the ABA. So when he came over, I'm sure it did have an effect, but it did seem to like it wasn't enough to, I guess, overcome the other obstacles that they were dealing with. So one interesting thing that I learned about through your book is the ways in which kind of some of the 70s marketing acts as sort of like a test case for what would go on in the 80s with Magic and Bird, and especially of course Jordan once joining Nike and revolutionizing the sneaker industry. But in the 70s, it was really the first time that NBA players, sold products on a high level. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had his own signature shoe, which was one of the first individual shoes. Walt Frazier was with Puma. Dr. J famous with Converse, and some other types of commercials. Pete Maravich had the Dry Control by Vitalis hairspray commercials, and was really hugely in demand in marketing terms, as you talked about in the book, particularly early in his career. And Bill Russell, as a coach, as a former player, had a series of long distance commercials with a Celtics journeyman, Ron Watts, that were very popular during the time. Sure. So there's a lot of like. A lot of pioneering things, in terms of the shoes, in terms of the other things that would, of course, bear fruit later on.
Yeah. So the idea that a player could sell something other than a basketball, or Pete Maravich sold, he was also a basketball spokesman, or had an endorsement deal with basketball. But the idea that they could even go beyond that, shoes are obviously a big part of the 1970s. The idea that players start to have footwear that is somewhat more individualistic, even though a vast majority by the late 70s are wearing the Dr. J Converse Pros, but that players had choices in shoes, and we're getting paid to wear shoes. Specific shoes was certainly something new in that period. And also the idea that these sports stars are celebrities is something that's rather new to basketball. Now, there, of course, were sports celebrities that were making lots of money on endorsements in baseball and in football. But the basketball starts to break into that is certainly new in the 1970s, that NBA players are their celebrities even off the court is very new. And as you mentioned, Pete Maravich is very much a leading figure in that. Maravich was, if you haven't seen his dry control by Vitalis commercials, that's something definitely to get on the YouTube and check out. They're fantastic. He's regularly called in those commercials, he has the best hair in the league. But this idea that they could endorse outside of their sport and be celebrities even off the court is definitely something that's really new for NBA players in the 70s.
Yeah, I remember Bill Walton in his most recent book talked about rejecting overtures from Nike and Phil Knight back when that was a very tiny company, and how in retrospect he feels like that was foolish, but at the time he was had obviously had no idea what was going to happen, and also was rejecting commercialism in most of its forms. So, but that's amusing in retrospect. Another thing, marketing, and this was kind of a television thing once CBS. I guess ABC and CBS both were doing it. I guess ABC more pioneered it with Roone Arledge, who is written about a lot in Breaks of the Game, is a very famous TV figure, and was really responsible for changing the way that the NBA was covered, and in terms of techniques of filming the game and also promoting the individual matchups. Bradley versus Havlicek or Reed versus Cowens. I think recently I watched one of the late 70s Sonics Suns matchups, and they're talking about two of the key players, and I think it was Walter Davis, and I forget who it was with the Sonics, whoever was the main defender on him, and they're talking about points allowed versus for each one. It was very much like looking at it as much as it was like an individual matchup, and like they were defending each other all the time, rather than the way defense actually works in the NBA. But it was interesting to kind of see just that being done. I hadn't really. I do think the individual matches were certainly thought of before then. I mean, obviously Russell versus Chamberlain was a famous thing, but they did sort of. The individuals were able to stand out more in the 70s than they were in the 60s. I mean, part of it was just, again, the players had much more power. They were making more money. They were more famous off the court, and that was kind of part of that. And obviously, to a degree, it was very successful. A lot of these guys became stars and outside of the league, and were able to bring a certain amount of growth, at least in the early 70s, in the league.
Well, I think the one of the key people in that, and I do write about this a little bit, is that Dr. J becomes kind of a one-man show, and despite the fact he's on a very good team, if you have Dr. J playing, that's a box office draw, and so it made sense not only for the live gate but also for TV audiences to promote. Okay, on Sunday, CBS is going to have the game of the week, and Dr. J and the Sixers are going to be playing, the Boston Celtics or the New York Knicks or some other draw. But the idea of using a player as kind of that anchor, that draw is incredibly important especially in the mid to late 70s. We start to see it earlier in the 70s, as you mentioned, kind of the Bill Bradley and John Havlicek, Willis Reed, Dave Cowens, matching up these players on some of these teams. But that was something that was absolutely used in promotions and in promoting these games really throughout the decade. And you're right, outside of people like Chamberlain versus Russell in the 60s, you hadn't really seen that before. So you'll even see by the late 70s, not even those incredibly well-known names. You might watch a San Diego Clippers game that talks about Lloyd Free, World Be Free is and is leading the San Diego Clippers into this game. And so it's not even just the elite players, it's the flashy players, it's the ones who have maybe some fan interests that are really driving these television matchups.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, I mean, they were building on what the college game had established to a degree as well, because the college game was, rivaling the NBA in popularity, and they were, kind of building the stars from there and then bringing them into the pros. Obviously, that was huge for Magic and Bird right at the time that they, with one of the, at the end of the decade, and, what was at the time the most watched NCAA title game of all time, maybe still is, and, transitioning them to the NBA, they were doing that a lot in the 70s as well, to varying degrees of success depending on the player. But mean, that was definitely a huge part of what was going on. And the way that the league was marketing itself, I think, is interesting too. You talk quite a bit about the, I believe there were two one-on-one tournaments in the early 70s. I know the first final was JoJo White and Bob Lanier, a kind of a interesting matchup there, given the size difference between them. Lanier basically backing JoJo down all the time. They also had like the red and round ball segments, which are always fun. They show them on NBA TV every once in a while with Red Auerbach, kind of showing different drills, and they would have Rick Barry, Pistol Pete, Dr. J, all there, kind of just kind of showing things off in the game, and they were kind of educational and fun, and kind of brought out some personalities there. And they did a early version of the dunk contest, but it was not a well formatted affair. It was a big tournament that happened in a lot of cities, and the favorites kind of got knocked out early, and it was kind of a big mess in terms of bracketing. But you get the sense through some of these things, and there are other things. There were kind of early versions of cheerleaders and things like that, where they were looking at trying to market the game. I'm sure they were borrowing some ideas that had come from the ABA that were definitely pioneers in that. But you get a sense that they understood they needed to do something different, but didn't exactly know how to do it.
So you mentioned a couple of the great new contests that are developed, especially many of them are developed after the merger. So the NBA saw the popularity of the ABA slam dunk contest in 1976, and they tried to do their own dunk contest in 1977, and it fails. As you mentioned, the big names get knocked out. I think they gave David Thompson like 3 tries. They kept putting him back in this single elimination tournament until he got eliminated for the third time. And so there's the dunk contest. There's a one-on-one contest, which, as you said, there's 2 years. In the first year, it's laughable if you've not seen Bob Lanier just back down JoJo White. Again, get onto YouTube and check that out. But in year number 2, it's even more interesting. Jeff Petrie of the Blazers beats Barry Clemens of the Cavs in a final that no one wanted to see. And then you have the horse tournaments, which were always really interesting. They would set up these horse games, and they would show them at halftimes of NBA games, and you'd have Pistol Pete Maravich shooting a 15-footer left-handed with not touching the rim. All these kind of, as you can imagine, it was a horse game, but they were really trying to draw out the personalities, the individual talents. That yes, basketball is a team game, but let's market these stars. Let's look at the one-on-one, the horse, the dunks as a way to create these auras around superstars. And I guarantee that they didn't want Bob Lanier, Jeff Petrie, Darnell Hillman to be the winners of these contests. They would have loved to have Dr. J or David Thompson win the dunk contest. They would have loved Pete Maravich to win the one-on-one contest or the horse contest, and it just didn't work out. And so the red on round ball was really interesting, kind of using it as a teaching moment. But by and large, these attempts at garnering interest in individual stars mostly fell flat, but they're fantastic to look at now.
Yeah, they may just maybe a little too corny, but yeah,
sure.
Yeah, but and the 70s are filled with all sorts of things where the wrong guy won or the wrong team won for the time in terms of like a business interest. I mean, the early 70s with the Lakers and Knicks, other than 71 when the Bullets were upset and we lost the Bucks Knicks matchup, which would have been kind of the marquee matchup at the time. The early 70s, those were all big matchups. But once you get to kind of to 74, you have a lot of kind of crazy upsets going on during that time, and just in obviously the late 70s with the Sonics and Bullets matchups, which are really interesting now, but at the time did not appeal basically to anybody. It's interesting how often that really happened, where the team that they probably didn't want to win happened to win. I guess that leads to all the conspiracy theories of the 80s and 90s later.
Sure, and I think that the 70s, one thing it definitely lacked was a dominant franchise, and they were close, man. There were a couple years where, especially in the early 70s, that either of the Bucks, the Lakers, or the Knicks might have won 2 or 3 titles in a row and really created kind of a mini dynasty. That at the end of the decade, there's the possibility of Bill Walton and the Trailblazers creating a dynasty, but things don't go right. So you're absolutely right that whether or not the league wanted a dynasty, one never emerged, and that looking back, it's really interesting because there's all this parity. There's this idea that any team could win in a particular year, but at the time it made it really difficult to to rally around a team or even to rally against a team because there was no big bad team to overcome that maybe we have today with the Warriors or the Cavs, these really kind of super teams that if they're upset, that's a huge upset. And in the 70s, you have some upsets, but there aren't those dynasties that we see really in every other decade in NBA history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing that is probably hard to appreciate is the fact that with expansion and with the ABA merger in '77, between '67 and '77, the league increases from 9 teams to 22 teams, and just how big a change that is in just a decade. I mean, we're used to a relatively stable league. There's been, a little bit of expansion here. The last team was added, I think, in 03, or 04 maybe. So it's been, more than a decade, obviously. And, we had, a little bit of a flurry in the late 80s and mid 90s, but it's done relatively slowly. I mean, there hasn't been vast changes in terms of divisions or, which team or which conference in a while. In the 70s, it seemed to vary from season to season, and it is in some ways wildly different than the league today. So that, I think, also makes it a little bit harder to tackle just in your mind of, okay, this team was where at what point and in what city and who was on the team. There's so much movement, especially later in the decade when it comes to free agency as well. It is really, I think instability is definitely the key word for what's going on throughout most of the decade.
Well, one thing I included at the end of every chapter in my book was almost a page of statistics, basically, that showed what teams played in what conferences and what divisions and what their records were. So you can really, I mean, if you looked year to year, you can see the ways in which conference affiliations change, that we have expansion taking place. And it's really stark if you actually line them up back to back, just to look at it's not instability so much as just the change that takes place, and that every year it seemed like there was a team either moving or new teams coming in. And to me, that creates a lot of excitement. There's that unknown element of new teams and expansion. And to add, like you said, for the league to more than double in size in a decade, obviously is going to lead to a lot of excitement and a lot of changes in the game. And that's part of the reason, of course, why there's no dynasty, is because when you go from 9 teams to 22, yes, of course, it's not easy to have a dynasty in the 1960s with Bill Russell. But if you have 3 or 4 of the better players in the league, as Russell's Celtics did, it's going to be easier to win year after year in a league that doesn't allow free agency than in the 70s, where you have more teams and you do have free agency. And that clearly doesn't explain the Lakers and Celtics dominance in the 80s or Jordan's in the 90s, but I think it does help explain why in the 70s that expansion is so important in really the culture and flavor of the NBA in that decade.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the league is just more settled, I think, in the 80s. I mean, there's more, it's just easier to, I mean, obviously there's still some of the same challenges that they have. The draft, you can't replenish as easily as you could in the 60s with the draft, because obviously so many more teams. But it is, you had, as we talked about that adolescence, you kind of had to learn the way that the league had changed throughout the 70s, and it took years to kind of learn that lessons. And with like 4 or 5 seasons of free agency, finally teams kind of figured out, okay, here's the best way to use free agency, here's the mistakes not to make. I mean, it took certain organizations much more time to learn it than other organizations. Obviously the Clippers about 30 years to learn it, but the Lakers and Celtics pretty much got it right away. So it is funny the way that that worked out. And even in the playoffs too, they expanded to 4 divisions, 2 conferences in 71. There was weird early seeding for the couple of years where the top 2 teams from each division made it to the playoffs. So a weaker division could have worse teams than a stronger division. There were some high 40 win teams that did not make the playoffs because of that, and some mid to high 30 win teams that made in the playoffs because of that. And then the expansion of the playoffs from 8 playoff teams in 67 to 10 in 75 to 12 in 77. And then you having best of 3 miniseries from 75 through 83. That kind of, it would be interesting to think about some of those playoff series, especially in the late 70s, if those had been best of 5 or best of 7, and how that might have changed the way the playoffs, kind of went along. Whether that would have just added, a little bit of extra burden on some teams that ended up being more successful, or what that could have done if they could have been more modern conditions, how that would have changed things. I do think that, even though there weren't really any huge upsets until the Lakers lost in 81, I still think that it's interesting to think about how that might have changed things a little bit.
Well, I think in general, the longer a series goes on, the more likely it is for the better team to win, right? So every team can steal in the NBA, every team can steal a game. And in a best of three, you just have to do that twice, right?
Sure.
And so in a 7-game series, the best team's going to win overwhelmingly, the majority of the time. And in a 3-game series, there's a lot more that can happen. And honestly, there's a lot of excitement in those 3-game miniseries. If you look, there's several that come down to the wire in the 3rd game, and there might not be any huge upsets, but I can tell you that there's a lot of excitement generated in a 3-game series that you don't see generated in the longer 5 or 7-game series, because again, the lesser team has a far better chance of stealing 2 than they do of stealing 4.
Sure. Yeah, I remember reading about Bulls and Blazers in '77, how exciting that series was.
Yeah.
Gilmore and Walton and all of that. And you kind of go through some of the, as we talked about, '77 in particular being a memorable year, and those playoffs are really, very fascinating as well. We talked about a little bit about some of the reasons why the league kind of lost its popularity in the late '70s, and you mentioned these traditional power teams that are in transition, and the Lakers had Kareem, but not much else. They were pretty strong in '77 and would have been good in '78, except after the Kermit Washington fight. The Knicks, they certainly tried to bring in star power with Spencer Haywood and Bob McAdoo, but this is really when a time in which salaries are kind of throwing the normal team dynamics out of whack. Where before that, there was certainly there's a certain pecking order to where the better players would make the higher salaries and the lower players would make the lower salaries. And everyone was probably underpaid, but there was you were kind of paid, at least in terms of tiers and in terms of pecking order, usually, at the level that you were worth. But as, as free agency happened, as competition from the ABA, it created these different dynamics in the teams, and it led to a lot of teams that on paper seemed like they should have been, pretty good. But, it really had dealt with chemistry problems. And that was like super new, but I think money, it was a greater concern, in the '70s than it ever had been before.
Sure. And you mentioned the Knicks, and to me, the Knicks are probably the most interesting team late in the decade. I'm doing some further research on them for another project. But the Knicks, since 1973, they win the NBA championship. 1974, at the end of that season, they have the retirements of 3 of their most important players. They face the retirements of Willis Reed and Dave DeBusschere and Jerry Lucas. And so the Knicks are really in transition, and they try to, I guess the modern conception be rebuild on the fly or reload rather than rebuild. They don't tear it down. They don't trade Earl Monroe and Walt Frazier. Instead, they try to bring in these ultra-talented but mercurial talents. Spencer Haywood is first, Bob McAdoo shortly thereafter, and they find these players that on paper, like you mentioned, should be really good teams, and then they get out on the court and their styles just don't mesh. That Haywood and McAdoo kind of want to play a very similar game, and they can't be on the court at the same time, but they're 2 high profile players, and so there's this idea that they have to be on the court, and the fans get upset because these star players who the team is paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for aren't producing, and so there's a backlash there. And so you have these, like you said, these power teams are in transition. The salary scale gets somewhat inverted, in which free agency leads to escalating salaries among players who many of them are proven players, but you start to have big contracts being doled out to maybe undeserving players, which leads to locker room jealousy. And so there's definitely a ripple effect in the mid to late '70s once that takes place.
Mm-hmm. And players should obviously it's good for them to get the kind of money that they should have, but there's no doubt that creates there are changes to an environment that obviously have to be dealt with when that happens. You mentioned a couple of interesting examples in the book. One that I had not heard about, but Howard Porter of the early '70s Bulls, who I had not been familiar with, but was kind of an example of. The Bulls were an excellent team in the early '70s, and maybe had a chance to make a finals or be a better team, especially kind of going into '75 once the Lakers and Bucks were kind of finished with their runs. But that was one example of really creating bad feelings between some of the players and Dick Motta, who was the coach and GM, and leading to kind of maybe the breakup of that team before it really needed to be broken up.
Yeah, the early '70s Bulls are one that I knew nothing about before I started working on this project. My extent of Chicago Bulls history dated back to about 1984 when a guy named Michael Jordan was drafted to the team. And so I had never heard of Howard Porter, let alone, I knew Jerry Sloan as the coach of the Jazz, but he was instrumental in those early Bulls teams. And the Bulls always seemed to be one piece away. They had a really good starting five, but they needed some depth. They wanted to add some youth, and their forwards, especially Chet Walker, wasn't getting any younger. He had been a part of the 1967 championship team in Philadelphia with Wilt Chamberlain and those guys. So by by 73, 74, he's getting up there in years a little bit. And so the Bulls looked to replace him, and they actually execute a cross-league trade with the ABA to acquire a man named Howard Porter, who had been interesting story in and of himself, as the ABA had signed him kind of under the table while he was in college, and there's this whole spiel with him, and I think Villanova is where he was from. And he comes to the Bulls on this huge deal, an unproven young player. I don't know if he was a rookie at that point. I believe he played a little bit in the ABA. So he comes onto this Bulls team that's a veteran team. They're very good. They're competing year after year for a spot in the finals that they would never actually make. And the players on the team get really upset that this unproven guy who on day one, he comes into practice, and the head coach at the time, Dick Motta, basically just says, this guy can't play. But there are, he's got this guaranteed no-cut contract. They have to pay him, so they keep him on the team. And he just drives a lot of problems in the locker room. None of his own doing, but just the fact of what he represents. And so very high-level players like Norm Van Leer, their starting point guard, and Bob Love, very good forward for them, hold out because they're upset Porter's making more money. And this leads to a lot of problems on the court later in the year in terms of they lose some seeding because they lost a couple games early. And but Porter is really kind of becomes an example of this inverted salary structure in which an unproven player makes money and causes a lot of discord in the locker room.
A couple others that I thought were fascinating later in the '70s, kind of once free agency becomes part of the equation, is Brian Taylor, who had been part of the Nets' great teams in the ABA, had made it to the Nuggets by '78, and he actually left the team in midseason, declared himself a free agent after he said they hadn't paid him, I believe, some bonuses that they had owed him. And then he never, ended up going back to the Clippers like a year and a half later. And also, this was celebrated because Red Auerbach had refused to pay Paul Silas a pretty high salary, thinking that he was a role player. They make this, stars make this, it's going to upset the team. But then Dave Cowens upset over that, and there were other issues as well, where he ended up quitting the Celtics for 2 months, I believe, the year after they had won the championship in '77, because they had done that, and maybe that kind of kept them from they fell off in '77, and then really started to get old in '78. Maybe that they had another possible maybe another championship run in them in '77 had they been able to keep Silas, and that was another issue that they ran into. Obviously Cowens, it being a eccentric personality and prone to do some interesting things, but there's another things that I think are you can't really imagine them happening today. Even though weird things happen in the NBA certainly today, I can't imagine either one of those things happening.
Well, I think a lot of that is it's the idea of free agency is new. And so that players now have the power rather than owners and rather than the teams is something that you mentioned earlier is just kind of being explored, and the players don't really know how to exploit free agency. The teams don't know how to manage free agency. And so you have a lot of examples like that. Player leaving in midseason is certainly unique, but teams not really understanding how to attract free agents or the idea of how free agents can benefit them is certainly something that comes about it. And those two examples are great. That Brian Taylor leaves the Nuggets in midseason. That was a Nuggets team that really had a lot of potential. And before Taylor arrived, they were pretty much a point guard away from competing for an NBA title. And with Taylor there, they were a really good team the first half of that season. And he leaves and they fall apart a little bit. They don't quite reach their ceiling. But I think a lot of that does boil down to just that free agency's new, players don't know how to deal with it, and it goes back to, again, this is a period of growth and adolescence in the league.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, one thing that I think is really unique about the 70s, and this is true both in the NBA and the ABA, but obviously our focus is in the NBA here, how many major upsets there are in the decade. And I did an episode on this with Rich, but just to kind of go over some of the really interesting ones briefly. 71 Eastern Conference Finals, a 42-win Bullets team beats a 52-win Knicks team. 73 Western Conference Semifinals, a 47-win Warriors team beats a 60-win Bucks team. 73 Eastern Conference Finals, 57-win Knicks over a 68-win Celtics. 75 Finals, 48-win Warriors over a 60-win Bullets. 76 Western Conference Finals, a 42-win Suns go to the finals beating 59-win Warriors. 78 Eastern Conference Finals, 44-win Bullets over a 57-win Sixers. And then 78 Western Conference Semifinals, 47-win Sonics beat 58-win Blazers. That is easily explained because Bill Walton was hurt during that time. That basically was the injury that ended his time in Portland. But the rest of those, there aren't necessarily injury-related, reasons for that. Havlicek did get hurt in the Celtics series in 73, but, that was really just like, man, there were all these upsets going on, and it adds to sort of the, like we talked about, in a lot of these situations, probably if the other team had won, it would have been better for the NBA's business, but it just happened that, there were some crazy upsets going on, and that, that kind of, the 73, the Bucks, that prevented them from having another shot at the Lakers, and the 71 that prevented the Knicks from having their shot at the Bucks back when the Bucks were in the East, and so on and so forth. The Warriors were unable to defend their championship despite being the best regular season team in 76, and so on and so forth. The Sixers in 78, who were a really good regular season team, but couldn't handle the unselled and Elvin Hayes Bullets.
Well, I think in a lot of these cases too, it's like obviously the modern game, you have to look at matchups, and you have between injuries and really good matchups that, if you take, for example, the 1978 Washington Bullets with 44 wins on the regular season, defeating the 57-win Sixers, the Bullets, I guess arguably their best two players are Elvin Hayes, a power forward, and Wes Unseld, a center. And they had a lot of strong inside players that could defend. And the Sixers like to take the ball to the hoop. They had Dr. J, of course, most importantly, and I believe they had traded for Bobby Jones. I think at that point, I think they had traded McGinnis away to Denver for Jones. I can't remember if that was that season or the next.
They still had McGinnis. That was the next year.
Okay, did they that year?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So
I mean, you have these guys that are good at attacking the hoop, but the Bullets have good rim protection, to use a very modern phrase. And so it kind of took the Sixers out of their game. The Bullets had good defensive guards that put a lot of pressure on the Sixers guards. And so, I mean, in that case, it was a matchup thing. I think that unfortunately that 70s era, late 70s Sixers team gets a lot of flack for choking in the playoffs, that somehow they didn't achieve what they should have done, that they should have won a title, and they should have done this and they should have done that. And I think it's unfortunate, because I think then we overlook how good those teams were, and maybe not incredibly fundamentally sound, but they were a lot of fun to watch, and I think should be enjoyed at that level at least.
Absolutely. Yeah, you wrote in the book how George McGinnis and Elvin Hayes traded a lot of trash talk during the that series, and how even in the press, Hayes was, kind of talking about how McGinnis was a guy who, kind of choked in the big moment and things like that. That was interesting color, because you don't get a lot about McGinnis and Hayes, either one as personalities so much, because of kind of the era that they played in. And McGinnis didn't have a lot of longevity. Excited that, of course, he's making the Hall of Fame. And Hayes kind of had a prickly personality and is kind of a little bit forgotten about after his playing days, even though he was an exceptionally good player. But it was just it was nice to get that kind of stuff that is really hard to find, unless you're really doing deep dives into the Bullets or McGinnis's career. It's just hard to find all that stuff. And that's obviously one strength of your book, is you really do just such an extraordinary job of researching and just adding all these different tidbits. Obviously you had the inspiration that you did, but it is such a a really great summary of what was going on with, obviously you focus on the important things, but you have a great sense of really interesting stories and really fascinating stuff. What were some of your favorite books that you read, or things that you did to research for the book?
So I'm very fortunate. I'm a university professor, so I have access to a university library, and I was able to make some research trips that are part of my job. So I was able to not only get a lot of books sent through the library, but also travel to South Bend, Indiana. To Notre Dame has an exceptional sports history section. I was able to go to the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame up in Springfield, Massachusetts, and do some research in their archives. And thanks to the wonders of technology, the entire runs of Sports Illustrated and a large part of the sporting news are online. So I was able to use those as research. So I was able to look at a lot of different stuff. And I'll tell you the two sources that I enjoy the most. One is a set of magazines that were produced in produced through I think the early 90s, Basketball Digest. And so Basketball Digest has a bunch of quirky kind of stories that go beyond the stats and go beyond the games and kind of dig into the personalities of some of the players. And then there were some books that I'd never heard of and was able to look at. I really enjoyed as I mentioned earlier, or as you mentioned earlier, I guess, David Halberstam's Breaks of the Game. That's kind of the seminal work on the 70s. But there have also been a lot of really interesting books about some different teams in that decade. So there's a book by a guy named Blaine Johnson called What's Happening that looks at the late 70s Seattle Supersonics. That's really interesting. Kind of it kind of is supposed to be somewhat like Halberstam's following the team around. Harvey Ayrton's When the Garden Was Eden looks at the early 70s New York Knicks. There are some great biographies of guys like Pistol Pete, David Thompson. Just some, just a vast array of stuff that I was able to find that kind of all comes together. And one problem that I had was stopping research. So there was just so much I could do. And even since the book's been the book was written, I still run into more stuff that I had said, yeah, man, I wish I could have added that to the book. But I'll tell you, when I wrote the initial draft was over it was almost 150,000 words, and the book now is under 100,000. So a lot was sent to the cutting room floor that was in my original research, and so I have pages and pages of research that it was really interesting, but just didn't make it in.
Yeah. Well, there are podcasts that perhaps you do want to talk about certain things. So, if you, any ideas you have, we'll talk about that off air. But, one thing I think we referred to it briefly, but some of the really interesting talent that came into the league in the late 70s, that 77 draft that we talked about with, Walter Davis, Marcus Johnson, Bernard King, like these, really, next level athletes that were surpassing, what even guys like Clyde Frazier could do just a few years earlier. And, other guys, Alex English, Adrian Dantley, they're guys who are kind of like right at almost at exactly the wrong age, because they kind of came to form before the 80s and then kind of were overshadowed by, Magic and Bird, and obviously Bernard King had his years with the Knicks and certainly is celebrated, but a lot of the other guys, maybe not quite as, appreciated just because of when they kind of, came to first thing, and a lot of them dealt with, instability early in their career. I mean, King was on several different teams. Dantley was on several different teams. Alex English and so forth. It was really interesting how, these guys who were coming into the league during a time in which there's increased player movement, as we talked about with free agency and such. Are there any guys that, really stand out to you as kind of, they were really important during the 70s, but they kind of got, lost in the shuffle for whatever reason historically, whether they didn't quite have that longevity or whether, just for whatever reason they are not talked about like today, like, they were during the time?
Well, I think there's a lot of examples of that. I think the 1970s are also a period of transition in the importance of the big man. So in the 1960s and through the early 70s, there was the idea that in order to win a title, you had to have an elite center. That if you look at the 60s, the guys that won titles were Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain, and in the 50s George Mikan and Bob Pettit had won, but he was a big man too in some ways. And so it was this idea that you have to build around a franchise level center. And you saw in 1970 and 73 Willis Reed, in 71 Lou Alcindor, in 72 Wilt Chamberlain, in 74 and 76 Dave Cowens. But then, Walton obviously leads the Blazers to victory in 77. But you start to see a movement away from this idea that you have to have an elite center to win the championship or to be a good team. And the 1975 Warriors are a perfect example of that. They trade away Nate Thurmond, who is seen even at the time as probably a top 5 NBA center, and they win the title. And so you have this influx of really super athletic wings, and you allude to Bernard King and Adrian Dantley, who are two of my favorite players looking back in the 70s. But then you have guys like Walter Davis and Marcus Johnson. You've got one that really I look at is a guy like Randy Smith, who played guard for the Clippers, or Phil Smith, who played guard for the Warriors, that are totally forgotten about. But were considered at the time as really top level NBA players. They were athletic, they could attack the basket. That this skill that's a skill that's really being seen of as important. Beginning in the mid to late 70s, that having a guard or a wing that could attack the basket and could score going to the rim those were valuable skills. And so those players are the ones that I really latch on to. When I watch game film, I like watching, Adrian Dantley. I like watching Bernard King. I like watching, Randy Smith. These guys that are, swooping to the hoop and scoring at the rim are the ones that I'm really drawn to from the 70s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even, Cowens, he was a center, obviously, but he was, undersized for position. He had a lot of more, power forward type skills. The guy like Alvin Adams, who was,
right,
with the Suns, battled against Cowens in 76, was more of, the passing big man. And I feel like in the 70s, obviously there were the great back to the basket big men, but there were a pretty big variety of big men too. Somebody like Tom Borwinkle, who was a very good passer for the Bulls, kind of helped drive that offense a little bit. Obviously, Walton with all of his great skills. I mean, even Kareem. We kind of think of the slower, more plodding Kareem of the '80s, but man, he flew around the floor in the '70s, particularly those Bucks years. I mean, he was really a guy who was just kind of doing everything, and obviously always had the overpowering scoring, but did so much else as well. So I mean, I do think there was such a great variety. You and and Rainus talking on his podcast recently. I thought you had really good discussion about looking at footage from the 70s and how there was just more a different kind of diversity in terms of shot selection and in terms of like kind of what to expect on a play where, we're conditioned, kind of with a more modern game to, not really expect mid-rangers, to kind of expect a certain shot distribution. It's kind of refreshing to see, different types of moves be shown, different types of shooting motions, different types of things, because, there, not that many games were on TV. These guys are all kind of growing up with different ideas of how to play the game, and the way that it kind of blended together in the 70s. It's obviously a different time because of those influences.
Well, I think one thing that I found really interesting is that every team had a unique style. And so you mentioned Tom Boerwinkle, and talk about one of my favorite players from the 70s. The only player I can compare him to, if you've not seen Tom Boerwinkle play, is kind of a Portland Trailblazers era Arvydas Sabonis, where he's a big, plodding big man that you'd throw the ball in the post, and then people would cut around him, and he'd throw the ball over his head or kind of throw a bounce pass at an angle you didn't expect that he could make it to. And so he was a lot of fun. So the Bulls ran very much a forward. Their forwards were their scorers, and their guards were back to guard against fast breaks. And Boerwinkle was kind of the pivot around which that offense rotated. And then you had teams like the Bucks and Lakers later in the decade who threw the ball into Kareem. And there's a great quote from Charlie Scott, who played with the Lakers and Kareem. And he said that, when he was playing for the Lakers, they had 22 seconds to get the ball to Kareem for his sky hook. And if they couldn't do that, then they had 2 seconds to just throw the ball up at the rim. And then you had teams, the Golden State Warriors in the middle of the decade are very much revolving around the passing ability of a forward, kind of a, they don't call him that, but Rick Barry is basically playing a version of a point forward in the mid 70s. And you just have all these different teams, the up-tempo run and gun of the 76ers later in the decade. And to me, that's fascinating that there were so many different styles that today, the NBA is a copycat league, and there was obviously that in the 70s, but there are just so many unique styles that teams played that I really latched onto in watching that footage.
Mm-hmm. So before we finish, there are quite a few, something I think that kind of gets forgotten is the notable coaches of the 70s, other than Jack Ramsey, of course, who's, very heralded from, Breaks of the Game and from his later television work. But a lot of the other top coaches of the decade, sort of been forgotten a little bit. I mean, Dick Motta with both the Bulls, and then late in the 70s with the Bullets. Al Attles with the Warriors, Bill Fitch with the Cavs in the 70s. I think he had coached another team before, of course, moving on to the Celtics and Rockets in the 80s. John McLeod with the Suns, Larry Costello with the Bucks, Lenny Wilkins, with the Sonics, Tom Heinsohn with the Celtics, and Gene Shue with the 76ers, and Butch Van Brett at the Golf with several teams. I mean, there are some really good, interesting personalities, and some obviously. I think the coaching in the decade started to gain a level of sophistication in a lot of ways. There were, they started to kind of have statistics. Scouting became more of a thing. There was obviously ability to watch videotape for the first time, and there was a level of depth that was greater than there had been in the 60s, for better or for worse. Some of the coaches were kind of known for overcoaching, but I think overall, obviously, added sophistication to the game, and probably made it into a better game, even with some growing pains. Are there any favorite stories involving any of the coaches from that decade that stand out to you?
So my favorite one is a coach you didn't mention, and that's Bill Sharman. So Sharman was an incredibly successful player in the NBA and with the Celtics back in the day, and then he goes to the ABA and leads I believe the Utah Stars to a championship in the ABA. Jumps and takes over the LA Lakers in 1971 and leads them to a title, one of the best teams of all time. But he was really interesting in that he's very much very sophisticated in the way he looks at the game. So he introduces the game day shoot around for those Lakers teams, which you can imagine goes over really well with Wilt Chamberlain, notoriously not a morning person. And then one thing that I found was really interesting is that he started showing his players game film so they can discuss it. And to keep them interested, he would occasionally have his film guy splice in a picture of a Playboy playmate just to make sure that they're paying attention to the screen. So they'd be watching this game film, all of a sudden there'd be a still shot of a Playboy playmate, and then back to the game. So Sharman was really interesting and innovative in the way that he developed his team. And also, he took a team that was either the oldest or second oldest in the league, and he made them a running up and down, fast paced team, and everybody laughed. He's not going to be able to do this, and of course he leads them to one of the greatest seasons in NBA history, and Wilt Chamberlain becomes this defensive monster that rebounds and throws long outlet passes. And so I think Bill Sharman is criminally underrated when looking at the best coaches, and in fact would have probably had a long and illustrious career, except that at the end of his 33-game win streak in that season, they play the Bucks, and the Bucks end up ending this streak, and it's such an intense game that he's yelling and he yells himself hoarse. The doctors tell him to take some time off, that his vocal cords basically are overtaxed, and he doesn't, and basically loses the ability to coach because it's so taxing on his vocal cords. So Bill Sharman is definitely one I would include among your excellent list of notable coaches in the 70s.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. We've in our 70s project, we've had a lot of fun times talking about Bill Sharman, and his innovations. Sure. You did a great job of illustrating, what an interesting coach he was, of course, both in the NBA and in the ABA, also the old ABL for the Cleveland Pipers.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Good times. Anything else that we didn't get a chance to talk about that stands out to you?
No, and so the only other thing is that I would encourage you, if you're interested at all in the stories that didn't, I obviously want everybody to read the book and to enjoy it and to talk to me about it on Twitter. But if there are things that you really want to dig more into, is that I have a blog that I've been working on as well. Kind of some of the stories you mentioned from the cutting room floor. Some of the stories that didn't make the book. So there's so many great stories that not all could even be included in the book. So definitely check that out, and you'll enjoy it, I think.
Sure, and we'll have links to your blog and your Twitter. I believe it's just Adam Criblez, and all the important things that Amazon link, of course, to for people who want to buy the book, which I highly recommend. It's an excellent book. I can leave that unsaid, I'm sure, but might as well say, we'll. Absolutely should definitely buy the book. And Adam, thank you so much for being on the program and for all of the times you have been on the program and otherwise helped out. Always appreciate having a friend in NBA history.
Thanks, Jason. Always good to be on.
And thanks, everyone, for checking us out. You can find us at the Step Back at fansided.com. You can also find us on Twitter and Facebook at Over and Back NBA. And also, if you like what we're doing, please leave a rating and review on iTunes. They make us feel good about ourselves, and that's important. So until next time, we'll be back soon.